US GDP with export, stock performance and unemployment, number 1527, VPT 083, the 8th of February 2026, Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation, category, Economics. Preface. My academic background was centered on mathematics, physics, and engineering, but my personal interests have always leaned toward literature, history, and philosophy. These two domains are often viewed as opposites, yet they have coexisted throughout my life. Although I studied at top-tier universities such as MIT, Columbia, and UC Berkeley, I never aspired to become a traditional academic researcher or a college professor. Instead, I was drawn to practical, real-world work across diverse industries, including defense, aerospace, nuclear power, computer hardware and software, semiconductor chip design, and AI algorithm development. From my mid-20s, I wanted to build and own my own business. To prepare for that goal, I spent 2.5 years earning an MBA in business management, economics, and marketing through night classes, while working full-time as a supervising engineer during the day. During my decade-long tenure as CEO and president of a publicly held high-tech company, my responsibilities extended far beyond technical leadership. They included business strategy, marketing, sales, stock market behavior, and constant awareness of broader economic conditions. Only after I sold my successful high-tech venture did my life change direction, following multiple heart attacks over a decade, and finally at age 55. I began an intensive period of self-study in psychology and medicine. That effort has now lasted more than 26 years. This brief summary of my academic training and professional experience explains why I later moved naturally into economic research, as well as other research topics that may appear unrelated to medicine. Given my life path, doing research outside of medicine is not a deviation. It is the most natural outcome of how I was formed. My way of thinking existed long before medicine entered my life. I learned to see systems, forces, stressors, responses, strains, trade-offs, and long-term consequences through engineering, business, markets, and human behavior. I have always used many different lenses to understand the world. I naturally apply pattern recognition to learn from and understand everything I observe. Medicine later became one more system, driven by my own declining health. I study and research medicine using the same underlying patterns and methodologies, except that the stakes are much higher. My own life and death. So when I move into economics, policy, history, or other non-medicine areas, such as zoology, I am not changing my identity or focus. I am applying the same core way of seeing reality. To me, these are all systems under stress, evolving over time. That internal consistency has always been there. Introduction. Traditional economic analysis often relies on linear correlations, short time windows, and snapshot indicators. While these methods can describe associations, they frequently fail to explain dynamic causality, cumulative stress, and recovery overshoot following major shocks. Gross domestic product (GDP), in particular, is usually discussed as an outcome rather than a strain variable evolving under multiple interacting stressors. In this study, I apply a combined viscoplastic medicine theory (VMT) and topological data analysis (TDA) framework to a 10-year U.S. economic dataset from 2016 through 2025. Although VMT was originally developed for biomedical systems, its stress-strain energy formulation is equally applicable to macroeconomic systems, which also evolve under cumulative loading, shock, rebound, and partial relaxation. TDA provides a geometric lens for understanding complex, high-dimensional data. Instead of focusing on single variables or linear correlations, I examine the shape, continuity, and connectivity of data clouds over time. This allows me to identify structural patterns, phase transitions, and trajectory shifts that are often invisible to traditional statistical methods. I combine VMT and TDA because they answer different but complementary questions. VMT quantifies how much cumulative stress energy has been absorbed by a system and whether that energy is approaching reversible damage. TDA reveals how the system's structural geometry evolves, whether it remains coherent, it forms gradually, or undergoes sudden topological change. Together, they form the viscoplastic VPT framework, which unifies energetic accounting with geometric pattern recognition to capture both the magnitude and the shape of system evolution over time. The goal of this paper is not to predict GDP numerically, But to understand which economic forces do the most cumulative work on the GDP system and how major economic events and influential factors raise the long-term GDP trajectory. Data and variable definitions dataset consists of annual values from 2016 to 2025 of the U.S. economy, including 1 output strain of GDP and 3 individual input stresses N1, N2, and 3. 1. GDP strain is scaled as GDP by 100 to amplify VMT energy observation, and later divided by 100 for TDA geometric comparability to avoid figure distortion. 2. N1 export growth percent, with a normalization factor of 33, N2 unemployment rate percent, with a normalization factor of 44, and 3. S&P 500 return on investment ROI percent, with a normalization factor of 8%. To ensure a fair comparison, all 3 input variables must first be normalized. Each normalized input is then multiplied by the GDP change rate over time, the strain rate, to convert it into a viscable stochastic stress component. Cumulative energy is then computed by integrating stress over strain across time using calculus, which corresponds to the area under the strain stress curve. During VMT energy calculation, I amplify GDP by 100x so that their resulting energy values are not excessively small or buried in decimal places. This amplifying scaling improves numerical visibility and interpretability without changing the underlying relationships or conclusions. On the other hand, for the topological data analysis radar chart presentation, I must use the actual GDP percentage values without the 100x amplification. Otherwise, the relative ratios between strain and 3 stresses would be distorted and appear out of order. VMT energy modeling. VMT strain stress diagram reveals several important features. First, export N1 exhibits the largest stress magnitude 52% across the widest strain range. Export contributes both strong positive and negative stresses over time, indicating sustained cyclic loading. When integrated over the full strain domain, export accounts for slightly more than half of the total VMT energy. This means that U.S. exports, that is, goods and services purchased by other nations, occupy more than half of the total influence on U.S. GDP within this model. Second, S&P 500 ROI in 3 shows fewer cycles but very high-amplitude stress peaks, especially during rebound periods. These high-amplitude stress injections contribute approximately 36% of total VMT energy. This behavior is consistent with stock markets acting as economic amplifiers rather than continuous drivers. This financial investment sector's more than 1/3 contribution to total U.S. GDP explains why Wall Street has such strong influence over both the U.S. and the global economy. Third, the U.S. unemployment rate and shows comparatively small stress amplitudes and limited strain U.S. GDP coverage. Its contribution to total VMT energy is approximately 12%. Indicating that unemployment functions primarily as a downstream response indicator rather than a primary driving force of the U.S. economy GDP. From a VMT perspective, total energy accumulation, not instantaneous values, determines long-term U.S. GDP system behavior. Therefore, the ranking of energy contributions provides a physically meaningful hierarchy of economic influence, and this VMT study, exports contribute 52%. S&P 500 return on investment ROI contributes 36%, while the unemployment rate influences U.S. GDP by only about 12%. Cumulative VMT energy over time. Cumulative VMT energy curve provides a time domain interpretation of economic stress accumulation. From 2016 through 2019, cumulative energy remains near zero, indicating a relatively stable operating zone with no significant accumulation of irreversible stress. In 2020, cumulative energy rose sharply to approximately 29% due to a GDP contraction of about -2.5%. In viscoplastic terms, this represents a compression phase, implying nonlinear, time-dependent, and permanent damage. In 2021, cumulative energy spiked to approximately 183%. This spike does not represent new damage alone, but rather a rebound overshoot caused by elastic recovery from the 2020 compression. The system released stored strain energy rapidly, overshooting its prior equilibrium. This unusual behavior occurs only when there is a sudden GDP jump or drop, as seen during the COVID crisis. From 2022 through 2025, cumulative energy relaxes and stabilizes near 100%, suggesting partial stress dissipation and entry into a new steady operating regime rather than a full return to the pre-2020 State. This behavior cannot be explained by snapshot indicators. It emerges only through cumulative, time-aware energy modeling. 3D TDA trajectory analysis. To visualize system evolution geometrically, I constructed a 3D scatter trajectory using all 10 years of data, with axes defined as follows: x-axis, GDP strain, real GDP % without the 100 multiplier, y-axis, export, and 1 z-axis, S&P 500 return on investment, ROI, and 3. This 3D diagram cannot accommodate the fourth dimension, unemployment, which is also the least influential factor in this model. Each year is plotted and connected sequentially to form a continuous trajectory. The resulting geometry reveals four distinct phases. 1. 2016 to 2019 form a compact cluster, indicating a stable pre-shock economic configuration. 2. 2020 shows a sharp inward displacement driven by negative GDP strain and export contraction resulted from COVID. 3. 2021 displays a large upward jump, representing rebound overshoot driven by export recovery and market amplification. 4. 2022-2025 trace a partial relaxation path toward a new equilibrium, not a retracing of the original trajectory. This confirms that economic recovery does not follow a reversible path. Once large cumulative energy is injected, the system topology changes. Radar chart interpretation. A radar chart using GDP 100, export, unemployment, and S&P 50 ROI for selected key years 2018, 2020, 2021, 2020 to further clarifies relative structural dominance. The radar geometry shows 2021 dominating GDP strain, export, and market ROI simultaneously, 2020 characterized by GDP and export contraction with elevated unemployment stress. Thus, as an extreme COVID year, unemployment remaining relatively stable across all years, compared to export and market volatility. This supports the VMT conclusion that unemployment reflects system response rather than acting as a dominant driver. Economic interpretation and consistency. From a physical and economic standpoint, these findings make sense. Exports inject external demand into the system and operate continuously, making them the primary engine of GDP dynamics. Stock market profits act as powerful amplifiers, injecting high-amplitude stress during expansion and recovery phases. Unemployment responds to production and investment decisions rather than initiating them. Therefore, within the VMT framework, U.S. GDP dynamics from 2016 to 2025 are primarily driven by export activity, secondarily amplified by stock market profitability, and only weakly driven by unemployment. This VPT analysis also captures the impact of COVID, with 2020 representing the worst shock year and 2021 representing the worst mortality year. Conclusion: by integrating VMT energy modeling and TDA geometric analysis, this study demonstrates that U.S. economic behavior over the past decade is best understood as a cumulative, path-dependent system rather than a sequence of independent yearly outcomes. Exports dominate long-term GDP energy contribution, stock markets amplify economic motion during critical phases, and unemployment functions mainly as a downstream indicator. Major shocks, such as the 2020-2021 GDP contraction and rebound, permanently alter the system trajectory through rebound overshoot and partial relaxation. This study shows that VMT and TDA together provide a powerful framework for understanding economic dynamics in a way that traditional linear statistics cannot. Disclaimer: I write this paper not for fame, but to share what I have learned so others can understand their health, prevent disease, and live a longer, healthier lives. This content is provided for educational reference only and does not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this summary freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyrights for this article and its related materials belong to the author, Gerald C. This content is provided for educational reference only and does not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this summary freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyrights for this article and its related materials belong to the author, Gerald C.